The following program was produced by an independent community producer. The opinions expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the QA-TV staff or board of directors. QA-TV, in compliance with FCC regulations, is prohibited from exercising control over the content of independent, member-produced public access programming.
Turn out the light. Believe. This is Greater Boston Paranormal.
Do you feel it? It went through like a path, like a wave.
Are you still here with us? What are your intentions?
Welcome back to the Greater Boston Paranormal TV. My name's Sondra Morgan, a paranormal investigator with the Greater Boston Paranormal Associates. And with me is Don DeCristofaro, our founder and chief. And we have, we bring the best guests to you guys. So let Don introduce them.
Our guest tonight is a gentleman by the name of Richard Estep. Richard is a prolific author of the paranormal and history, military history in particular. He's a paramedic as well, I believe. He teaches courses for paramedics and first responders. And as a result, he's been involved in a lot of TV shows that revolve around first responders, hospitals, and things of that nature. I'm going to say he's written about 20 books, but we're going to ask him the number when he comes on. So Rich.
Welcome.
Hey, good evening, Dylan. How are you?
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Wonderful.
I'm so glad you could join us.
Thanks for having me here. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, we've known each other a little while now. We've been aboard the ship now a couple times, and I've been anxious to get you on because there are some questions I want to ask you about a couple of your books, and I know Sondra has a couple of things as well. So, but let's start off with the number. We're in about the 20 neighborhood. Does that sound about right to you?
34.
Okay, so I was in a much smaller neighborhood than you are. All right.
How many do you have coming out? I mean, are they all out now?
There are 34 out. There are several others contracted,
Okay.
and quite a few on the drawing board as well. So I always have several projects on the go at any given moment in different stages of research, production, pre-production, editing, and so on.
It's funny that you say that, and I'm fascinated by that. And you and I have talked about writing and that process. And I was just saying to Sondra before we went on that process is, as I said, fascinating to me. And I can't even begin, as somebody who has 6 things half finished and can't finish any of them, it's mind-boggling to me that you could have numerous on the drawing board at the same time and not focus singly on one project. Do you go from project to project when you have numerous things going at the same time?
It helps avoid burnout. We've all heard that burnout is a thing, and it can be in any field. So to keep things fresh on any given day, this morning, for example, I'm on deadline for a book about the Second World War. So today, earlier, I was writing about Charles de Gaulle, a brief biography of him. Was just writing about MacArthur's meeting with Emperor Hirohito in 1945 after the surrender of Japan. Tonight, I'm going to be writing about the haunting of Whispers Estate. So having multiple things on the go like that, I think keeps it fresh, stops it getting stale, and stops writing from feeling like a chore, which it sometimes can if you're not careful.
I know that you also wrote a book, Building the Right Life, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Yeah.
Don, there you go.
A lot of people come up to me at events and conventions, and they say, I'd love to write a book, but ... and the but is the most common one is I don't have the time, then I don't know where to start. How would I get published? Self-publish, get an agent, go to a publisher. And I got asked so many times, and I like seeing people succeed. So I learned a lot on my own publishing journey. I have 5 different publishers, and I self-publish. And so I wanted to bundle that all together into a book for people that ask those questions and want to be given kind of a roadmap on how to get their own book finished and into the hands of readers.
Well, I tell you what, I'm going to be ordering it because little do you know that I've been working on a children's book as well.
Oh, good.
So
Okay.
I'm definitely going to be purchasing that one on Amazon.
All right. Well, that's kind of what we were talking
Yeah.
about. The difference between being able to write well and being able to write to completion.
Right. That's the hard part.
Structure and flow and all these things. To me, it's easy to write well, but to put it all together into something that's meaningful is really the chore. At least that's what it's always seemed to me.
Well, when I teach paramedics emergency driving, one of the things I teach is it does nobody any good to get to the hospital, halfway to the hospital really fast, And it's true. I know a lot of people that have written 50% of a good book or 70% or 80% or whatever it is. Doesn't matter if you don't finish. The worst thing I ever wrote and published is of more value than the best thing that's still sitting on my hard drive untouched, right? And so until you get past that finish line and you can put it out there, it doesn't really exist in real terms. So no matter how bad it seems or how good you think it is, until you get to the end and start then going through editing and improving it in multiple drafts, it's just a great big dollop of potential, good or bad.
Now, the first time I actually ran into you and recognized that who you were, because I did meet you on the Salem once, is when I was watching Asylum 49. And to me, that was just wow. I mean, that's an amazing story. And I know that you just went there again recently, correct?
Yeah, just a couple weeks ago, Dustin Parry and I did an event there. And I know he was just out on the Salem recently,
Yeah,
too.
yeah, just a couple of weeks ago, him and Brian Cano were just on the Salem. Yeah, they were.
So how's the paranormal going at Asylum 49? Still pretty active?
It's good. It's never as active this time of year as it is in the fall. Because right now the haunt is kind of lying dormant. They'll start building the new Halloween haunt this year, probably at the end of July, beginning of August. And as we all know, construction, destruction, those kind of things are what trigger paranormal activity. So we still got some good results, but nothing like it's going to be in 2 months' time when spooky season kicks in.
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting, though, because I think our experience on Salem, to some extent, is the opposite. When we had that haunted house event aboard the ship, some things happened because there were numerous permanent residents of the ship who were unhappy about it. But I think the activity aboard the ship right now far exceeds anything that's happened during any of the haunted house events. But I think the Salem, though, is a little different, isn't it? In that the reason behind the haunting, correct me if I'm wrong, it's more to do with the men who lived and served on the ship and loved the ship. It's more to do with that than the fact you have people coming in a certain period of the year to get the crap scared out of them. Right. No, that's where I was going. You're absolutely right.
Yeah, I mean, so, ghost ships, stories of haunted ships are plentiful. And as spooky as some people like to make them, a lot of the time, it's, I think, because, you have a real band of brothers and now sisters on a warship, They live together, they pull together, they even though the Salem, unless I'm wrong, never went to war as such. Correct? Am I right about that?
Yep, you're correct.
You still have this very close-knit bond. You have a family. And I see this with haunted firehouses all the time. I was in the fire service for 15 years. So many haunted firehouses, and people think, oh, it's because firefighters are around death and blood and trauma. It's not that at all. It's that a firehouse is a second home. For some people, it's their first home. And I think a ship like the Salem was the same way for many of those sailors and officers. I'd be amazed if they didn't stick around and weren't keeping a watchful eye on the old lady.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Rich. We've talked about it many times. One of the predominant spirits on the ship, and you've heard us talk about the chief many, many times. And I've said all along that the reason the chief is there is because the ship was home to him. The crew was the real family that he had, and this is where he wants to spend his time, and we treat him with respect. the respect that he deserves as a chief petty officer and as a man who served our country, and I think he appreciates it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think the first and only time I came to the Salem, as you'll recall, I made a point of stopping at the top of the gangplank or whatever it's called. I'm sorry.
The gangplank. Yep.
But I stopped and asked for permission to come aboard. And it's just one of those small courtesies that you offer to the living and the dead, that are the custodians of a ship like the Salem. You know, a little respect in and out of uniform goes a long way. So I went out of my way when I was on board the ship to be respectful to the ship, to its crew, to the men and women that look after it now, the flesh and blood men and women, and also to the flag that flies on the ship. And I think that makes a huge difference.
There's no question about it.
Yep. Definitely treat them with respect is our motto. So
absolutely. So a couple of things. So I watched. Actually, I listened. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot. I was told that I need to say hello to you. I recently spoke to a young woman in the UK by the name of Emma, who is part of the Spine Chillers and Serial Killers podcast.
Okay.
And she told me not to say hello. She told me to say hello, which apparently is the way she says it. The reason we were talking was because we were talking about the Sally House initially, and we moved on to Villisca, and then she brought up Fox Hollow. Mm-hmm. And I mentioned to her that, you know, I had watched a documentary, and I think I told you this. I watched a documentary about Fox Hollow some time ago, and I came away kind of shaking my head because I really thought that it was pretty vanilla and it was really disjointed. And I think I told you at the time they would have been much better served to read your book and to talk to you about it. And Emma told me that when they did a 2-part episode on Fox Hollow, your book was their primary resource.
Oh, I appreciate that. I'll have to go check out that podcast.
Yeah, it's pretty good, and I want to show it so everybody gets a look at the book. It's really amazing. I mean, Fox Hollow is about as disturbing story as you're going to read, I think. But this book is very, very well done, and I really liked it. I wanted to ask you a little bit about a place like Fox Hollow, because so much happened there, and things happened there over a short period of time. When is it Baumeister, Herbert Baumeister? Mm-hmm. Is that right?
Yes.
When he was there, but then the family, of course, that moved in afterwards had a lot of problems, and they had a guy that lived in their guest house, I believe, that had a lot of problems. Mm-hmm. How much time did you spend at Fox Hollow, Rich?
All in, it was about a week on the ground, and a lot of that was not just soaking in the atmosphere, but interviewing witnesses, eyewitnesses, people that lived there, people that had lived there. I interviewed the one victim that we know of that got away from Baumeister, right, as well, and just kind of investigating the neighborhood. So it was divided into 2 different times of the year. The first time was in the fall, as I remember, like November, and the other was in warmer weather. And being kind of an idiot, I went into the pool itself in November.
You read my mind. I was going to ask you if you went in the pool.
Yeah, it was. I'd not to talk smack, but I'd seen a TV show that went there and they didn't go in the pool, and I just thought, why would you not do that? If you have what is essentially a pool that is at the heart of the case, why would you not get in and experience that? And I got growled at by some unseen thing while I was swimming in that pool, surrounded by my investigators. So I like to be hands-on when I go tell these stories. You know, I'm not just sitting there regurgitating stuff from other people. I like to be hands-on as much as I can in that environment. You got me a haunted pool, I'm going in that pool.
And the pool was most definitely, I don't know whether you'd say it was the heart of the whole thing, but it was most definitely a major player in the story. I just thinking about the mannequins, around the pool that Baumeister had set up around the pool absolutely freaks me out.
Can
no
you
question.
Give us a quick
Yeah,
little summary?
and I learned that each one of them had a backstory that he'd come up with.
No kidding.
Each one had a name and a backstory that he completely invented. He dressed them as if they were going to a beach party. And yeah, what a surreal and what an awful thing. And they were the last things that some of those poor, unfortunate men ever saw.
Yeah, the last thing they saw. What a sick dude. So Sondra reminds me that, could you do us a favor and give us a quick synopsis of Fox
please.
Hollow? Because a lot of our listeners, a lot of our the people that are watching probably have no idea what we're talking about.
Well, essentially, during the 1990s, a serial killer named Herbert Baumeister was operating in the area of Carmel, Indiana. Prior to that, he was, it is believed, very strongly believed, that he was murdering men while he was on the interstate picking up hitchhikers, because a number of men were found, young men found in states of undress, strangled, dumped by the side of the highway. Those murders not only fit Baumeister's MO, but they stopped as soon as he and his family moved into Fox Hollow Farm in Carmel. So Herb was a family man, wife and kids, but like so many serial killers, he had a very dark side and a dark secret. When his family was away, usually they would go to Lake Wawasee for the weekend. He would go into Indianapolis and he would frequent gay clubs and would pick up men, preferably homeless men, men that he judged would not be missed. He would tell them he was a contractor working on a very cool house with a pool in the basement, and he would take them back to his home to Fox Hollow. They would skinny dip in the pool. He would tell them that he was very much into autoerotic asphyxiation. And so he would invite them to strangle him, and he would strangle them to death before disposing of their bodies in the woods behind the farm. And that went on for several years. Anywhere between 11 and 19 victims died at Fox Hollow at Herb Baumeister's hands. That number is based purely on missing persons reports and the number of unique bones that were found at Fox Hollow before he was finally caught. And before he could be arrested, he drove across the border to Canada, found a state park, parked on a beach, had his last dinner, was his favorite meal in the world, a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, and blew his brains out with his dad's Magnum, which was nicknamed Dirty Harry. Unsurprisingly, the future owners of Fox Hollow Farm claimed that it was haunted, that they were seeing the apparitions of young men in and around the farm. And I was invited to go investigate for myself in person. That brought us to the book about the case.
Well, it is an amazing.
Yeah, it is.
It is just an amazing story.
And when you were there, did you run into anything paranormal?
Other than the growl.
Yeah, we had a number of things
yeah.
happen, all of which are documented in the book. I can't guarantee you that all of them were paranormal, but some of them I have no good explanation for whatsoever. And on the very last night, we had done pretty much everything and were ready to leave. We left just before sunrise, so it would be about 4:30 in the morning. The owners of the house, Rob and Vicky Graves, were asleep upstairs, so we closed and locked the door on our way out. And I'd booked into like a Best Western or something so we could get some sleep before flying back. And I got a phone call maybe half an hour after my head hit the pillow, and she said, it was Vicky Graves, and she said, Richard, we loved having you here. We can't wait to read the book, but we're trying to sleep. Can you make less noise down there? It sounds like you're tearing the house. So I had to break the news to her that I was in fact 2 miles up the road in a hotel. Whoever was ransacking her basement was not me. And of course, when Rob got his gun and went down to check, nobody was there. The door was still locked. There was no signs of intrusion at all.
It's pretty amazing.
Unbelievable.
Very amazing.
So that brings us to, I wanted to ask you a little bit about Villisca too. And I have to admit, I just ordered it. I have not read your book about Villisca. I'm sorry for that. I generally don't like to bring it up if I haven't read it. But as I think you may know, we spent the night out at Villisca last June. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about your impressions of Villisca. And Villisca is something that you don't have to give a recap of because we've talked about it a number of times on this show. And I do know that Johnny Hauser wrote the foreword to your book, and Johnny's a great guy. He was a very great host.
He is the most American guy I've ever met. Which I said,
Yeah, I can see that.
Like when I first pulled up to the house, Johnny Hauser was on a Harley Davidson in the middle of the street with shades on, just staring up into the sky. It was the most American thing I've ever seen. The only thing missing was a 50 cal mounted between his handlebars, which he probably has now.
I was just going to say, which he may well have.
Yeah, he might right now. I love Johnny to bits. He's a wonderful guy. But no, I think that the key thing about the Villisca house is almost all of the claims of paranormal activity come after Darwin Lynn bought the house and saved it from disrepair by restoring it. I know I've heard a couple of claims here and there that people that rented the house, the 40s, 50s, and 60s, might have had a couple of odd things happen, but the vast majority of the claims come post 2000s when the house was restored to something like its former state. And I don't think that's a coincidence because, as you know, you walk through that door and you're going back in time 100 years.
Absolutely.
You have no power outlets. You have no electricity. You have no lighting in there. You don't even have an indoor toilet. You go out to the barn for that.
That's right.
And it really is kind of like a time capsule. And you also have the framed pictures of the murdered family, and the two Stillinger girls are looking down at you from the walls. So the mood there is very unique and very evocative. And Johnny Hauser swears the house has a personality of its own, and I believe him. He texted me last time I was on my way there, and he told me he thought the house knew I was coming, which was one of the most intimidating things I've ever heard. And it was a day that somebody had been bitten on one of the tours of the house.
Oh, very
So-
nice.
I remember that one.
I don't subscribe to the theory that a lot of people do, that this is the killer behind the haunting, and I'm not entirely sure that, and I hope it isn't actually any of the victims either. One of my theories about the house is that so many people that go to Iowa visit Villisca, so many paranormal people, as I call us, me, you, our tribe, our people that do this. I think that those constant visits have really funneled into the paranormal activity there, and I think more than a few people have taken psychic hitchhikers, if you will, that have dropped off there, and now the house is haunted by who knows what.
That's true.
Well, we certainly know that happens.
Yes.
And it happened to us in the form of, there were a couple of things Johnny told us before we went in. One of which was that it would be likely that we would have conversations with people that were not from the house, but were connected to some of us. And the other thing he told us, which we thought was interesting, was he told us that something would happen that night, and in the morning we would never agree on exactly what the heck happened. And the truth of the matter is, not only in the morning did we not agree about it,
Still don't.
it's over a year later and we still don't agree about
What happened?
what happened. And the irony of that is that the occurrence that we're talking about wasn't paranormal.
Oh, interesting.
Three of the folks were, you were one of them, right? Sleeping in the living room. Amanda Cook and I were upstairs. Michelle and Lou were upstairs. And all of a sudden they were awakened by this banging on the wall from the outside.
Yeah.
So I won't tell the whole story, but I got up and Amanda got up, everybody was awake, and blah 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 blah. Later, when we got home, I called Johnny and I asked him to please take a look at the security footage for X period of time. And sure enough, you can't see what door they banged on, but you can see these three guys running up onto the porch.
Yeah.
So clearly,
two things that reminds me of. One is that when I interviewed Johnny in the house, he was in the house maybe 30 seconds, and the entire house shook as if a car had hit it. And of course, there was no damage. We never did figure out what that was. The other thing is that, kind of like you described, the most frightening thing I think that happened to me at Villisca was 2 o'clock in the morning one night in the living room with one of my fellow investigators. There were just two of us in the house at the time. And the kitchen is lit up completely, blinding white light.
Whoa.
And there is a pickup truck parked outside. And the parking is kind of like a ramp. So if you park on it, angles the lights up into the house. And my truck was out there. So whoever this was knew that somebody was in the house. So I stood in the window looking back at this truck, and it sat there for 10 minutes just with high beams just lighting up the house. And I was partly, I was ready to go on out there and confront whoever it was. But there's a voice in the back of my head saying, this is a great way to get yourself shot. Then they drove off. 5 minutes later, I guess they circled the block, and there they were back again. Another 5 minutes of high beams into the house, and then they disappeared. But I know there are people around that like to mess with whoever's in the house, and I suspect there are people in town that really don't like the fact that visitors are coming in from out of state for that reason.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yeah.
I grew up here, and we're at the Quincy Access Television Studio in Quincy, Mass, where the ship is, which is where I grew up.
Yeah.
And it's one thing to be known, Quincy, Massachusetts, the city of presidents, the only city in America where 2 presidents were born, died, and are buried here. It's a whole other thing to be known as the small town where one of those horrific mass murders in American history took place in 1920.
Yeah.
Right?
You're absolutely right. I mean, but those towns are everywhere. I'm a huge Civil War aficionado. No one would have heard of Gettysburg if it weren't for the 4th of July weekend, 1863. No one. The only remarkable thing about that town was the crossroads that brought those 2 armies to there. So I think sometimes, you just kind of have to accept the hand you've been dealt. And in the case of Villisca, Iowa, there are hundreds of railroad towns across the U.S. nobody has ever heard of, and Villisca is on the map, unfortunately, for that one thing.
Right. True. Well, it's funny, and we spoke to, we had Troy Taylor on a few weeks ago, and we talked a little bit about, we talked quite a bit about Villisca, of course, and we talked about, you brought up railroad towns, and of course that's a big part of one of the Villisca stories is
Troy's book talks about that,
and I think towns.
It's The Man from the Train Theory, right? Which is another excellent book by Bill James and his daughter. And honestly, I believe that is who killed the Moors and these Stillingers. I do buy into that. I've never thought that it was Reverend Kelly. It just doesn't seem to be a good fit for me, And if you look at the sheer number of of axe murders that took place near to these railroad towns and how similar they all were, there is a huge pattern there. We had some near me in Colorado Springs, twice on the same night, same sort of houses. The killer used their own hatchet, never took his own. He made sure there was no dog to bark. Always entered through a ground floor window. Covered the mirrors, covered any reflective surfaces inside the house. You can hit that checklist all the way down. So I know that the town of Villisca lived in fear for months, thinking it was one of their own. That, first of all, that a killer had was hiding in one of their basements or sheds or outhouses or whatever. They searched the town. They brought in bloodhounds. It took months before they would finally accept that the killer was not coming back.
And the Reverend is he's one of those guys that's, if you really don't look at it too closely, then he's a great fit, right? I mean, he was kind of a nutcase, and
he's a peeping Tom, right? We know this.
That's right. So if you really don't look at it too closely, then he's easy to jump on as a suspect, I think.
Well, and I think that the police were looking for that. Did you, while you were out in Villisca, get a chance to go to the cemetery and visit the Moor's grave?
We did.
Yes, we did.
Do you notice how big it is?
Yeah.
Do you know why it's that size?
No.
Because for listeners that haven't been, the grave of the Moore family, the 6 that were murdered, in addition to the 2 Stillinger girls, it's a huge grave. It is much bigger than the ordinary grave, and the reason is it was actually paid for by the reward money that was never claimed to identify the killer.
No kidding.
Yeah, it remains. Villisca remains, I think, one of the great unsolved American hauntings. Murders.
I don't think there's any question about it. That's another one of those. And when we went out to the Midwest, that's for ghost hunters, especially here in the Northeast. That we have our historical places, that's for sure. We're very fortunate because of where our office is. But to go out to the Midwest and to visit some bucket list places, we spent the night at the Sally House and we spent the night at Villisca. That's a once in a lifetime. That's a once in a lifetime trip for us. And so, needless to say, we didn't fool around. We went out to the cemetery and we spent some time there. We looked around. One of the reasons we haven't done an episode there is we got so much footage that I don't know. I ultimately don't know what we're going to do with it all from that trip last June.
Yeah, the Midwest has its rich veins, doesn't it? I have a Sally House book due out next year. Having spent many times visiting that house.
I'm glad you said that because I was going to ask.
What did you think of it, the Sally House?
I do think it's active. I was fortunate enough to interview the Pickmans, who were kind of the epicenter of the original haunting. Sure. And I was fortunate enough to spend several nights in the house myself, awake and sleeping. Some nights, nothing at all. Some nights, it was more active. I do think it's a genuine haunting, but I also think there is a lot of propaganda out there from individuals that are trying to push a demonic narrative in order to gain views.
Which is not, I mean, you know, sad to say, that's not an unusual scenario.
No, it isn't. It's becoming more and more common.
Yeah, it sure is.
We're seeing content creators, not singling anybody out, but we are seeing content creators that are willing to say almost anything in order to get likes. And the problem is they're doing it in locations which have experienced genuine tragedies. So as if the human misery that has taken place in some of these cases wasn't bad enough, they then compound it by distorting the facts and cheapening the horror of what actually went on there. You know, you don't need to add malicious, negative entities for a haunting to be genuine and a compelling story, but it won't get you as many views, as many likes, and as much money, will it?
No, you're
Sadly.
you're absolutely
Sadly,
right.
yeah.
And we, you know, one of the things we talk about a lot, our gang, is, you know, that the field is becoming a circus, and we are working very diligently not to become some of the clowns. You know, this is something we work very, very hard at. We certainly have a good time when we go places. There's no question about that.
Yes, we do.
But there's a big difference between having a good time and then getting down to business when the time comes. And
yeah, I agree with you.
We pride ourselves.
You can have fun and you can be respectful. And we talked about respect already, but part of that respect is that you tell the truth. You don't exaggerate or blow it out of proportion. And I've rented places. Sometimes, you know, I've spent a few $100s to rent a place for the night, and not a damn thing happened.
Sure.
You know, I mean, to pick one off the top of my head, Bobby Mackey's Music World, which many people will tell you is the portal to the underworld. I had the quietest night of my career there, completely unremarkable. I'm not saying it's not haunted. I know people that have had crazy experiences there, or so they say. But I refuse to invent a narrative just because I want to sell you a book.
No, I hear that. I mean, that's important. And you know, we all know, those of us who do this, that it's, you know, one place that leaps to mind, a place that I'm drawn back to seemingly over and over, is the Hinsdale House.
Yeah.
And
book coming out on that next year as well.
Oh, no kidding. Oh, that's great. That's great.
Dan let me have the place in order to research it last year, and it is a terrific location.
It really is. But I have no problem saying to you, I'm going to say I personally have been there probably 5 nights. As a group, we've been there 4 nights, I believe. And I don't think we have one shred of what you would call evidence. We have a couple of
personal things like
we have a couple of iffy EVPs. We have no video. We really have no pictures. But each and every one of us has a story to tell about what's happened to us
there
at the Hinsdale House.
Yeah.
There's no
a lot of the
question
times
about
it's subjective, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's personal experiences.
Sure.
Yeah. I got a little more evidence at Hinsdale than that, and I found it to be a very interesting case. I would go back any time. But by the same token, you know, we know the stories. The house was exorcised and so on and so forth. We didn't see anything that I would term like dark and demonic or anything like that during our stay. So you have to look at the evidence as a whole, right, and ultimately form your own opinion. I have a lot more respect for those people in the field that put their boots on the ground and actually go to the location to find out for themselves.
Sure.
Those are my kind of.
Sure. I mean, you know, honestly, the best hard evidence we have in terms of video and a couple of pictures from Hinsdale is outside the house.
Outside. I was going to ask if you went outside.
Up
Yeah,
the,
out
up the
back.
hill
I'm
at the
gonna
tree.
bet money it was out back in those woods.
Up the hill
Yes.
at the tree.
Yep.
The tree. Yeah, absolutely.
We have a picture, Rich, where one of the times we went, there was only 4 of us, 3 of the girls and myself. And it was tough. We didn't make it far up the hill because I'm going to say there was about a foot of snow. So we did, however, go out towards the pond. And I don't know when you were most recently there. There's a beautiful dock there and stuff.
Yeah, last February it was.
Stuff like that. This is before any of that was there. So we went out to the pond and kind of went to the left, and we saw these footprints coming out of the bushes in the snow. And one of the girls followed them down into the bush, and we watched them, and they looked to be a man's boot print. And then seemingly the boot was gone, and it seemed to be a barefoot. And by the time the pond was frozen, by the time they got out onto the pond, they looked more like a claw of some kind that was about the size of maybe a toddler's foot.
Yeah, I've heard stories of there being Wendigo in those woods and all kinds of things, which, depends on what you believe, right? Your own mileage may vary. All I know is that there is definitely something active at Hinsdale, and I'll be the first to tell you that when I write my book, I won't have solved the mystery. I've got some experiences, I've got some opinions, and I've got a bunch of research, but I think that place is like an onion, and people are peeling back new layers all the time.
All the time. Couldn't agree more. And we didn't go Wendigo, we went Pukwudgie.
Yeah, it's a very East Coast thing, isn't it?
yeah, we went Pukwudgie. Wendigo would be more in a different part of the country.
So, Richard, I did a little, obviously, research on you, and you mentioned that you got involved in the paranormal field because of experiences at your grandparents' house.
Mm-hmm.
What, can you share any of that with us?
Sure. I grew up in one of those, and during the 1970s, my grandfather fought in Burma, fought the Japanese in Burma during World War II. And so while he was away, my stepdad and my aunts and uncles were all growing up being raised by my grandmother in one of those big kind of World War II, generation families. And they used to all talk about the old lady that came to tuck them into bed at night and make sure that everybody was ready for lights out. And it took them a couple of years to realize that this was not a flesh and blood woman. This was the apparition of the former owner of the house who had died downstairs before my grandparents took ownership of the house. And she only ever appeared to the children, and she only ever did it when my grandfather was off in the war. When he returned, she was a very active spirit by all accounts. And when he returned from the war, she stopped appearing, almost as if it was a case of, I've helped keep an eye on the kids, crisis is over, mission accomplished, and off she went. So I always found that a very heartwarming story, but it was also kind of creepy because I had that bedroom all to myself and I would stay with my grandparents. So I imagine being 6 years old in that room, you've heard those stories and you're just terrified that every creaking floorboard might be this old lady that's coming back to tuck you into bed. She never turned up. I was there in the 1970s, so she hadn't been seen for 30 years.
Oh, wow.
But those stories kind of got into my blood, and my aunts and uncles all described her the same way. They all told the same story. And that is what sent me to the library, because there was no paranormal TV back in those days. Some would say thankfully so. There were books, and so you had to read the works of people like Harry Price and Hans Holzer and whoever the library might stock. And doing that, you can draw a straight line from that directly to me having a writing career today.
And you're talking about guys who, I often say this when we go places and we talk to people and they all ask, what got you involved? I always tell them that, similar to you, I think I'm one of the few paranormal investigators out there, at least that I know of, who never had any experiences whatsoever until I started investigating. But when I was a kid and my friends were reading Robert Louis Stevenson's Kidnapped, I was reading Hans Holzer's Ghost Hunter.
Right. It kind of gets into you at a formative age.
No question about it. No question about it.
I've always maintained that, you know, you take an interest in this stuff and it will take an interest in you back sometimes.
Yep. I mean, you know, I grew up with Borley Rectory and Jeff the Talking Mongoose and these things. And
Soon to be a movie with Simon Pegg.
You know, I just saw that someplace. That's unbelievable. That is
I'm
unbelievable.
looking forward to that. The Haunting of Cashin's Gap is a fascinating story.
It really is, and that's, like I said, that's one of the stories. You know, sadly, however, having begun reading about those things so long ago, what that does a lot of times is leave you shaking your head at things you see. For example, you know, we talk about The Conjuring. We spent the night at the Conjuring house, and I can remember seeing the second Conjuring movie and thinking,
oh, what they did to Enfield.
And thinking, wait a minute, I know this story. I know this story well.
The Warrens were at Enfield for one morning.
That's what Guy Playfair, was it Guy Playfair? Is that his name?
Guy Playfair and Morris Gross were the two men that basically lived with that family for years.
Yeah.
And relegated to a very minor role in the film. Then again, you know, you watch a movie like, say, Pearl Harbor or Braveheart, and if you expect that to be history, you are very much mistaken, right? Hollywood will never let facts get in the way of a good story. And don't get me wrong, I love the Conjuring movies as long as you don't treat them as fact. They're not fact. They certainly bear no resemblance to the documented accounts of those cases. I enjoy them, but I think there's a real danger that people think the Enfield haunting was a case for the Warrens when it really wasn't at all. You know, they weren't there at the beginning, they were barely there in the middle, and they weren't there at the end.
No, you're right, and I agree. There's a real danger to that because what happens over time, you know, you and I may have read about Enfield, you know, years ago. But people who are just finding out about it now, they don't know what the story is. And the vast majority of people, frankly, they aren't interested enough to find out.
Right. And again, why let the facts get in the way of a good story?
Right.
There was a much better TV adaptation of it called The Enfield Haunting, which, if you haven't seen it, it's on Amazon Prime.
I have seen it. Very good.
Yeah. And they still took liberties with that. You know, you had Guy Playfair being like hurled through the air across the room and pinned to the wall, which never happened. But it's fiction, you know. One of the reasons I like writing books so much is that, number one, we all know how boring paranormal investigation can be.
Yes.
And I can cut out 4 hours with one paragraph. That's fantastic. I tell my readers, I get bored so you don't have to, you know. And so I do not have to invent these kind of fantasies in order to tell the story accurately. I just need to cut out some of the boring bits with a line or two there. I also don't have a production company or a network breathing down my neck telling me that I have to deliver something scary or else.
Right.
So the writer still has an advantage over somebody who's working in Hollywood when they're telling these stories. But the downside is that we are becoming less and less a nation of readers, unfortunately, and many people would rather accept the Hollywood version with all of its excitement and its untruth than actually read about what happened.
No, you're right, and that's what I was talking about earlier. It's sad, but that is absolutely the case. It's just so much easier to accept what's spoon-fed to you. And you know, so many people see based on a true story as being a true story, when we all know that's the furthest thing from the truth.
Just little bits and pieces.
Right. That's the furthest thing from the truth.
Exactly that.
You know. So I do want to ask you. We're bordering on time, but I do want to ask you. Of all the places, which is the one for you? Of all the places, not just that we've talked about, but that you've written about, which place is the one, as far as you're concerned?
Much as I dislike that question, because it's like asking if you have multiple kids, which is your favorite kid, right? But for me, it's Asylum 49, and I'll tell you why. It is not just the haunting. It is the fact that when the cast, which is primarily kids and teenagers, comes together each year to do that haunt. This is small town Utah where there is not a lot for children to do. And without that place and that positive outlet, I shudder to think where some of these kids would be in terms of drugs and crime and mischief. But it's a place where the ghosts and the living have come together to create something good, something greater than themselves. They have a weekend every year where they, instead of charging an admission fee, they have people bring a donation for the county food bank.
Nice.
And they raise literally more than a ton of food for those who need it.
Oh, that's great.
So I love to see people that take the paranormal and they not only make a little money with it, but they decide they're going to do some good in the world. You know, there are people out there that are actually doing this for more than just lining their pockets. And that's for me why I love to see Asylum 49 brings the living and the dead together to help out.
Well, you really threw a wet blanket over me there, Rich. That's not what I was looking for at all. It was a great answer, but it's not what I was looking for at all.
So what are you looking for, Don? Are you looking for the most intense, the scariest? What
I
are you
wanted
looking
you to scare the hell out of me.
Well, that was one of my questions too. Is because as paranormal investigators, we all get scared at some point.
We do, but I do want to throw this out, and I think our viewers know this, and I think you know this as well. When you talk about people lining their pockets and things of that nature, the Greater Boston Paranormal Associates, we're aboard Salem every weekend, and every single nickel we raise goes to the United States Naval Shipbuilding Museum and the USS Salem. We don't make a penny off any of the events we put on.
We're just there for the fun.
And it's mostly fun. It's fun a lot of the time. So go ahead.
and there's a lot of, I've seen events to benefit veterans as well.
This
We have one
coming
coming Saturday.
weekend, we have a homeless an outfit called U.S. Vets that primarily focuses on homeless veterans. We have a fundraiser for them this coming weekend.
Right.
And next time you do that, unfortunately it's a little close to the deadline for you now, but next time hit me up in advance and I will send some signed books for auction or raffle or whatever.
I absolutely will.
So don't let me forget. But yeah, I know that we all have our own reasons for doing this, and we love that jolt of adrenaline you get sitting in the dark. When you're in contact with something not of this world, there's no thrill like it. And it is a lot for me like working 911, Most of what I do, both as formerly as a firefighter and now as a paramedic, most of what we do, 90% of it is waiting for the other 10% to happen, you know? But when it does, you're reminded of why you signed up. And so I do love those locations where I've had a brush with something that I think is not of this earth. Fox Hollow is one of them. Malvern Manor in Iowa is another one. Villisca, to a degree, is one. And then across the pond, places like the Black Monk House, the most violent, it's claimed anyway, poltergeist outbreak on record. So those kind of places I've had sleepless nights in before.
That's a great story. I've heard it on a bunch of podcasts, read about it quite a bit. That's a place I'd very much like to.
I'm sorry, I missed what's the name of it.
I'm going to pronounce it wrong. It's the Black Monk of
Pontefract.
Pontefract.
Yeah.
And that is.
It's in Great Britain. It's a castle, and it is supposedly the most violent poltergeist outbreak in history.
Have you been there?
I lived there for a week. It's not actually a castle as such. It's really the equivalent of a duplex house.
Oh, is it really?
It reminds me a lot of Enfield in so many ways. The house looks very similar to the Enfield house.
Oh, no kidding.
The house, the family is very similar in composition. Other than there were two parents, not one. But you have that classic of the teenager entering puberty. All those ingredients of a classic poltergeist outbreak. And this, I think one of the key things about Enfield is you didn't have a lot in the way of apparitions. But in Pontefract, you have this large, like 7 foot tall, black-robed monk, which stepped out of the wall one day, terrified the parents in their bedroom, and I slept in that same bed, staring at the wardrobe for hours before I could fall asleep. And it just is an intriguing case. And we all know poltergeist cases. I tell people that they're basically the shooting stars of the paranormal world.
Yeah,
they
that's
burn very
exactly
bright,
right.
they're very intense, and then they're gone. But the Black Monk case kind of peaked and troughed. So the initial outbreak happened during the 60s when it was national news. I mean, this was covered on the BBC. They had journalists camped out on the traffic circle outside the house some nights. Died down, and then they released a Hollywood movie about it called When the Lights Went Out. And after that, there was this huge resurgence of interest in the case, and the house became active again. So
Well, I guess
that is definitely
I guess maybe
the top
because of
UK look.
because of the Black Monk, I just assumed it was a monastery.
So what's really interesting about the case is that the story of the Black Monk came up in the 60s. The book was called Poltergeist by Colin Wilson. And it turns out when you dig, there's not a shred of evidence that there was ever a monk on that site. There was a monastery in Pontefract, absolutely. But the story that was told is that this monk supposedly molested a young girl, and when the villagers found out, they killed him, and they dumped his body down a well on the site of what is now the Black Monk House.
Okay.
Now that's the first rat you should smell, because who in their right mind takes their only water supply and contaminates it by dumping a
Got
corpse
a
in
body
it?
down there.
Right.
Makes no sense. However, that story just grew and grew, and the idea of this black monk just took root. Now, yes, he's seen, and there have been a couple of potentially very interesting photographs of the black monk, but the story behind is absolutely unverified and unverifiable. So it's another of those complex layered hauntings where it still has mysteries to be revealed.
But it sounds good.
And
this
that
monk who
house
was killed by the
that house
townspeople
is,
and thrown down
crazy.
the wells.
The house was such a small house. The level of activity goes from 0 to 25 out of 10. It's full tilt boogie one night and quiet as the grave, pun intended, the next. You can just never tell.
I love that. I mean, that's a lot of locations, and we see it on the ship. Although we're very, very fortunate. The ship is about as active as it
it's
gets
very active.
at this stage of the game. And we're very lucky that way. But we certainly have been plenty of locations where, as you said, you can be there one night and
Be
full
nothing.
tilt boogie is a great way to
Yeah.
put it. Everything is just going nuts, and then you go back there again, and there's just nothing.
It's like
Yeah.
And that's
Snorefest. Yeah.
yeah, and that's just the way it goes. And that's just the way it goes. That's just
Yeah, they don't perform on demand, and nor should they be expected to.
Right.
No.
And hence why people egging them on and
Well-
taunting them is just not cool.
no, and that's another thing we don't really allow.
Yeah.
The entities on the ship, they speak to us. They answer questions when we ask, but pushing them and prodding them is not something we do. They don't deserve it.
No, and I think I'm a big advocate, Don, of treating a location as I would if it was still functional. I would not go onto a modern-day United States warship and puff out my chest and start yelling at people. My ass is going to end up in the drink very quickly if that happens. I'll go overboard, right? And rightly so. I also wouldn't walk into a prison and start screaming and challenging people. Those who do that, I believe, are really just insecure, or they're trying to be edgy or controversial. Provocation I've done very rarely. I did it at Fox Hollow for the simple reason that I have no desire to be nice to the spirit of a serial killer.
Okay.
But I'm not doing that at Belisca, where you're running the risk of of the spirits of murdered children being around. Why would you do that? And so I think as a rule of thumb in this field, treat a location as you would if it was still up and running. Treat an old abandoned hospital as you would if you walked into a modern day hospital. Security's going to throw you out if you start screaming and antagonizing people, right? So
Sure, absolutely.
behave with some respect and rein your ego in.
That's a great point, and I never really considered it. And I've just always looked at it from the standpoint that provocation, no. But you really raise a good point. You're talking to a Herb Baumeister. This guy is not deserving of a whole lot of respect. He's certainly not somebody that you should feel as though you need to treat with kid gloves.
No.
So maybe doing whatever it is you think you need to do to get a response is acceptable in that case. I never really thought about it that way, but
But I also
makes
think
sense.
that's the very rare exception. I mean, to pick another of my favorite locations, Fort Mifflin on the Delaware, you know, the fort that saved America. I felt really drawn to that fort because the majority of people go there and they think about the defenders that defended it during the siege, Continental soldiers, you know, all very brave men, including their families that were with them sometimes. I went because nobody ever thinks about the redcoats that were involved in the battle and the siege at Fort Mifflin. But either way, those men on both sides served in uniform and fought for a cause they believed in, and in many cases died for it. And so if you show them anything other than respect, it makes you a horrible excuse for a human being. And there are too many that are willing to do that for their own benefit in the field. Don't be one of them.
No, you're absolutely right. And I think we've talked enough that, you know, as a former military guy, I absolutely see it the same way as that. You know, a soldier is a soldier. A soldier is a guy who put it on the line for what he believed, and that's deserving of respect, regardless of what color his jacket was.
Absolutely. And it just fascinates me, you know, that there may be an opportunity to go to these places and still connect with them and let them know that they haven't been forgotten. I was in Concord and Lexington, Massachusetts last year, and I walked the Battle Road, which, if you're not familiar with it, after the British went to Lexington and Concord in search of weapons that they never found and came back, it became the British Army's version of Black Hawk Down, in which every
That's a great analogy.
Yeah. And there are graves and there are markers along the battle road of where those boys fell. And obviously we can all agree that fighting for a fat, mad king on a throne 4,000 miles away is not the best move. It's certainly not a cause any soldier wants to die for. They're still deserving of respect.
Yeah, my son and I used to go to the reenactment every year when he was little. And I want to say the year of the millennium, they reenacted the whole thing.
Yeah.
So we walked the battle road. We walked to the Bloody Elbow and the whole thing. It was just
Walker's Revenge
it was
and stuff
just
like that.
it was amazing. It was amazing.
There's no substitute for following in their footsteps and for reading the ground yourself, for walking the terrain and experiencing it. And it should just deepen the sense of respect you have. And the good news is that the vast majority of people appreciate that. I just want that to be the way that the people in our community behave. I think we as a community have a reputation that's sometimes deserved for being cowboys, for want of a better term. Not that I've anything against literal cowboys. I'm an old West history fan myself, but you know, there are yahoos out there that are giving us all a bad name.
Every
we
day.
can do better. Yeah,
Every day.
We should probably start by policing them ourselves.
Every day. And you know, I like to think that's happening to some degree. Not the way it should, but to some small degree, I think it's happening. I think the tide is beginning to turn a little bit. Unfortunately, there are so many opportunities now on television and podcasts, you know, on the internet, that there's room for a lot more of those people. And where there's room, you know, a vacuum, a void will be filled. That's just kind of the way it goes.
True. And I think the answer is this, that we all get to choose as consumers, whether you're buying a book or watching a show or watching a YouTube segment, you get to choose who you support with your time and attention. And a lot of these individuals are basically attention thieves, right? They will say or do anything to get attention. But there are those good, honest people out there that are creating content that is worth your time, that is valuable, that is respectful. Just support the ethical ones. Do not watch those that turn this into a circus.
No.
Total agreement there.
I agree. Okay, I think that's a great way to wrap up.
Yeah.
Rich, I just can't thank you enough for joining us. As I said, I was looking forward to it a great deal, and I'm looking forward to seeing you. I don't know when the hell that's going to happen again, but I'm looking forward to seeing you again sometime and spending some time together, because I've always enjoyed our time together.
Yeah, me too. Hopefully I'll get out to Salem again someday. I would like to be there without the 50 members of the public if possible.
I'll tell you, we would love to.
Yes.
We would love to have you. And I'm going to tell you right now, you would be amazed at the work we're doing on the ship nowadays. You would be amazed. We have big time investigators aboard for events, and they are amazed at what happens to them aboard Salem. And it's right up your alley, right up your alley. So I really think you'd enjoy it, and we'd love to have you. Anytime you're in the neighborhood, all you have to do is reach out and let me know. We'd just love to have you. All right?
Sounds good. If I get the opportunity, I will definitely do that.
You got it. Okay. Thanks
Thank you.
again,
Thanks,
Rich. We
Richard.
really appreciate it. And you take care of
both.
yourself.
Take care.
Have a great night.
You
You
too.
too.
Bye now.
Good night.
Well, that was a great conversation. He's a great guy.
That was good. Rich, he is really a great guy.
He really is, and very knowledgeable, and his take on, how the paranormal field should be.
Absolutely.
It is exactly the way we look at it.
Absolutely.
So,
As I said, he is a top-notch guy. I love the way he does things.
he's pretty funny too.
And he is. And you know how it goes. You see these books, and there's 900,000 books about the paranormal. I don't even know how many of the people I know have written books about the paranormal. But Rich, along with a Troy Taylor,
Yep.
There's enough of a history sprinkling. And
I love the history part of it.
too. And he is a historian.
Yep.
And he places just as much emphasis on the history as he does the paranormal. That's one of the things I really
awesome.
enjoy about him. So,
All right. Well, hey, thanks for joining us again. We really appreciate it, and we'll see you again soon.
don't forget to join us on Facebook, USS Salem Paranormal Experience, Greater Boston Paranormal Associates. We are on YouTube at
Yep.
Greater Boston Paranormal TV and Greater Boston Paranormal Associates, not the Greater Boston Paranormal
It's
Associates.
Greater Boston.
Greater Boston Paranormal Associates.
Yes. If you want to find out more about each of us on the team, go on to
TheGBPA.com.
the GBPA. Yep. Awesome. Well, thanks again.
Thank you very much for joining us.